When you think of Cary Grant and Clark Gable, you picture two icons, immortal Hollywood royalty, who defined what it meant to be a leading man. But behind the charm, style, and movie magic, a silent feud was brewing, one that most fans never even suspected. Because while they posed for photos and walked the same red carpets, Cary Grant couldn't stand Clark Gable. And what makes this even more shocking? It had nothing to do with money, fame, or romantic jealousy. According to sources close to Grant, he didn't just dislike Gable, he despised what Gable represented. The world saw two gentlemen, suave, smooth, and larger than life, but Grant saw something else entirely. To him, Clark Gable wasn't just a rival, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with where Hollywood was headed. And over time, that quiet resentment turned into something deeper. This wasn't just a professional rivalry. It became a cold war over the soul of American cinema. Cary Grant had built his reputation on charm, elegance, and a sense of sophistication that made audiences fall in love with him again and again. He was the kind of actor who made it all look easy. Every glance, every smile, every line, flawlessly timed, impossibly smooth. Gable, on the other hand, came from a different school of performance. He was raw, tough, rugged, the kind of guy who chewed his lines like tobacco and spit them out with a grin. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. But to Grant, that kind of appeal felt primitive, lazy, almost barbaric. And that's where the tension really began. Because as the movie industry started shifting from elegant wit to brute masculinity, Grant started to feel like a dying breed. Audiences were changing. Studios were changing. The days of smooth-talking, effortlessly stylish gentlemen were fading. And Gable was leading the charge. He wasn't the only one, of course. Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift, all part of a new generation that brought grit and emotional chaos to the big screen. But Gable had gotten there first. He was a prototype, and Grant never forgot it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Grant didn't just roll his eyes in private. He spoke out, publicly. He mocked these newer styles, calling the rising generation of actors godawful and warning that they'd finish each other off before the industry found its way back to grace. That kind of open criticism wasn't just rare, it was risky. But Grant didn't care. He was on a mission, and part of that mission meant taking every subtle opportunity to distance himself from Clark Gable and what he saw as the collapse of Hollywood's golden standard. Why did Cary Grant hate Clark Gable? It wasn't personal. It was ideological. A war of performance philosophies disguised as a quiet Hollywood rivalry. But that's just the beginning. Cary Grant and Clark Gable may have shared the same era, the same fame, and the same spotlight, but they were born in two completely different universes. Their careers may have run parallel, but their lives and values were worlds apart, and that's exactly where the tension began. Clark Gable was Hollywood's king, the blueprint for macho stardom. Born in rural Ohio in 1901, he didn't grow up with privilege or polish. He was a self-made man, hardened by physical labor and sharpened by a relentless ambition to make something of himself. He learned acting the rough way, on traveling theater circuits and in second-rate silent films before finally breaking into talkies. His charm wasn't about finesse, it was about force. He oozed confidence, swagger, and sexual dominance. He didn't play characters so much as he dominated them. Cary Grant, meanwhile, was the opposite kind of story. Born Archibald Leach in England in 1904, he also came from humble beginnings. But where Gable was rough and rowdy, Grant was measured and meticulous. He trained in vaudeville, developing impeccable timing, elegance, and a kind of effortless charm that became his signature. Everything about him was refined, his walk, his voice, his suits. He was an embodiment of class, not just in appearance, but in the way he carried a scene. He didn't have to push. He glided. And that's why the two never clicked. On the surface, they had so much in common. International fame, loyal fan bases, powerful screen presences. But underneath, they couldn't have been more different. Gable represented brute masculinity. Grant represented refined masculinity. Gable demanded attention. Grant earned it. Hollywood, of course, had room for both for a while. But as the film industry evolved in the 1940s and 50s, it started leaning heavily toward Gable's kind of stardom. The public appetite shifted. War heroes, rebels, tough guys. These are the men audiences wanted to see on screen. Grant, who had built a career on wit, charm, and understated strength, watched as a louder, more forceful kind of masculinity took center stage. And at the heart of that trend stood Clark Gable. What made it worse was that Gable wasn't just a trendsetter. He was untouchable. The studios loved him. The media adored him. He could get away with anything on or off set. While Grant worked hard to cultivate an image of grace and humility, Gable could show up late, speak his mind, or bully his way through a scene, and still be hailed as a hero. For someone like Grant, who prided himself on professionalism and precision, that kind of recklessness wasn't just annoying, it was offensive. The tension wasn't loud. There were no tabloid fights or on-set blow-ups. It was colder than that, a slow, icy disdain that built over years, fueled by deep philosophical differences, clashing worldviews, and a growing sense that Hollywood was choosing sides. And for Cary Grant, it felt like it was choosing wrong. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Cary Grant had already cemented his place in Hollywood history. He wasn't just a movie star. He was the movie star, the guy with the perfect suit, perfect hair, perfect timing. But something was changing. A new wave of actors had begun to rise. They didn't care about polish. They didn't memorize lines with perfect enunciation. They grunted. They mumbled. They smoldered. And to Cary Grant, they were the beginning of the end. And he wasn't shy about saying so. In a rare public interview later in life, Grant vented his frustration over the shift happening in Hollywood. When asked about the younger generation, he didn't hold back. "Godawful idols," he said bluntly. He was talking about Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift. Actors who brought a raw emotional intensity to their performances. But the criticism didn't stop there. Grant lumped Clark Gable into that group too. Not because Gable was young, he wasn't, but because he represented that same brute force acting style Grant found so irritating. This wasn't just about taste. To Grant, this was about standards. He saw himself as a craftsman, someone who had worked for years to perfect a style that relied on subtlety, wit, and intelligence. Watching Gable and others stomp onto the screen with scowls, cigarettes, and clenched jaws felt like a betrayal. It wasn't acting, in Grant's view. It was noise, and audiences were eating it up. He couldn't understand why Hollywood had begun to reward emotion over elegance. Where once charm and control had reigned, now it was all about being real. But to Grant, that new version of real felt clumsy, overacted, almost vulgar. It was everything he had spent his life not doing. And the fact that actors like Gable were being celebrated for it, that stung. Grant made his distaste known in subtle ways, too. He famously turned down roles that leaned into heavy, tortured characters. He avoided playing angry, gritty men. He even rejected scripts that leaned too far into melodrama. He wanted to keep things sharp, stylish, under control. In his eyes, that was the art. And he couldn't help but feel that actors like Gable, who seemed to shout instead of speak, were turning that art into a circus. But it wasn't just a generational divide. It was personal. Grant had spent his entire career cultivating dignity and grace in a town that thrived on scandal. Watching Gable, who was known for his backstage affairs, diva moments, and disregard for studio decorum, rise to the top didn't just confuse him. It offended him. So when Grant publicly roasted the new breed of actors, it wasn't just a dig at Brando or Dean. It was a veiled strike at Gable too, a way to draw a line in the sand, to say, this is who I am. That is not. And behind those calm words and graceful performances, Grant was drawing his own battle lines in a war over what Hollywood was becoming. On paper, Cary Grant and Clark Gable should have been allies. Both were adored by millions. Both reigned as box office king for decades. and both defined what it meant to be a leading man in Hollywood's golden age. But when you look closer, it was clear these two icons weren't just different. They were destined to collide, because charisma, while magnetic, isn't always compatible. And in the case of Grant and Gable, their very existence challenged the other's identity. Gable's charisma was physical, loud, and unapologetically dominant. When he entered a room or frame, he took over. He didn't ask for attention. He commanded it. There was a ruggedness to him, a kind of confident swagger that made every woman swoon and every man feel inferior. He made masculinity look easy, natural, almost primal. Grant, on the other hand, was all about precision. His charisma was calculated, graceful, effortless, but never accidental. He used his voice like a jazz instrument. Smooth, rhythmic, never overdone. He didn't need to raise his voice to control a room. He had that quiet power, the kind that made you lean in rather than back away. His appeal wasn't in your face. It was magnetic in its subtlety. And that contrast, boldness versus finesse, created an unspoken rivalry that simmered for years. It didn't help that Hollywood often compared the two. Magazine covers would place them side by side. Who's the real king of Hollywood? Polls would pit their performances against each other. Fans debated endlessly. Gable's raw magnetism or Grant's polished wit. For two men already dealing with massive egos and immense public pressure, the constant comparison wasn't just exhausting. It was deeply personal. Behind the scenes, mutual respect was thin. Gable reportedly viewed Grant as too polished, too pretty. There were whispers that he didn't think Grant had the guts for the kind of emotionally raw roles he took on. Meanwhile, Grant saw Gable as crude and unrefined, someone who bludgeoned his way through scenes rather than finessing them. To Grant, it wasn't just about how you acted. It was why. And he believed Gable was acting for all the wrong reasons. The tension wasn't explosive, but it was ever-present. You could feel it at award shows, at studio meetings, at Hollywood parties. Gable, loud and laughing, holding court with a drink in hand. Grant, cool and detached, quietly judging from across the room. They never had a public feud, never traded barbs in press. But anyone in the industry could sense it. The cold shoulder, the stiff handshake, the subtle digs passed off as jokes. This wasn't just two different styles. It was two different ideals. Two different versions of what a man should be, how a star should act, and what Hollywood should celebrate. And neither was willing to budge. For fans, it was invisible. For insiders, it was legendary. The rivalry between Cary Grant and Clark Gable never exploded into a headline-grabbing scandal. No shouting matches. No fiery press feuds. But don't mistake silence for peace. Behind the polished smiles and carefully arranged photo ops, a quiet storm brewed, and Cary Grant knew exactly how to navigate it. He didn't need to confront Gable directly. Instead, he played the long game, using his influence behind the scenes to carve out a Hollywood that fit his standards, not Gable's. Cary Grant was no passive player in the industry. By the 1940s, he had enough power to pick his projects, rewrite scripts, and walk away from studios that didn't meet his expectations. And when it came to projects that would have placed him alongside Gable, he didn't just hesitate, he refused. There were a handful of high-profile films where both names were tossed around as potential co-stars. Yet somehow, those projects always quietly fell through. Industry insiders noticed, even if the public didn't. Grant was never openly hostile, but he made it clear. Sharing the screen with Gable was not on his agenda. It went further than just movie roles. Grant was strategic in the social sphere. 2. He avoided events where Gable would be the center of attention. He skipped galas and gatherings where the risk of awkward photo ops loomed. And when the press tried to drum up stories about the two icons together, two titans of film side by side, Grant deflected with diplomatic vagueness, polite smiles, carefully worded answers. Always cool, always distant. And while Gable didn't speak much publicly about Grant, those close to him knew the feeling was mutual. Gable reportedly saw Grant as overly calculated, a man who worked too hard to maintain an image, too focused on elegance and control. It didn't sit well with Gable's "what you see is what you get" mentality. Their energies simply didn't align. Gable was chaos wrapped in charisma. Grant was control in a tailored suit. There were deeper layers to the avoidance, too. Some biographers have speculated that Grant, who guarded his private life with obsessive care, saw Gable as a walking liability. Gable's scandals were constant. Multiple marriages, public affairs, and off-screen outbursts. For Grant, who valued discretion above all, Gable was everything you wanted to stay away from. But here's what made the tension so unique. It was all unspoken. There were no dramatic showdowns, no betrayal. Just two men who stood on opposite sides of a cultural shift, refusing to meet in the middle. Grant didn't try to sabotage Gable's career. He didn't need to. He simply stayed in his own lane and subtly made sure their paths never crossed. And in doing so, he preserved his image while quietly drawing a line in sand. The cold distance between them wasn't just personal. It was political. A quiet campaign to shape the future of Hollywood. One handshake, one decline role, one Dodge event at a time. In a town built on image and illusion, whispers often carry more weight than headlines. And when it came to Cary Grant and Clark Gable, the whispers never stopped. For decades, Hollywood insiders traded stories about the tension between the two icons. Rumors of resentment, subtle sabotage, and a quiet rivalry that never made it into the tabloids but was well known among those who mattered. There was never a smoking gun, no public falling out, no dramatic interview quote that confirmed the beef, but the signs were everywhere. Directors noticed how Grant would flatly turn down scripts if Gable's name came up. Studio executives learned quickly not to pitch them as a package. Photographers at red carpet events knew not to expect a photo of them together. In an industry that thrives on stage camaraderie, their consistent distance spoke volumes. And then came the speculation. Some said Grant was secretly jealous of Gable's effortless popularity with men. A kind of rugged, alpha appeal that Grant couldn't fake even if he wanted to. Others believed it was Gable who resented Grant, whose cool elegance and polished intellect made him look like the more serious actor in elite circles. Even though Gable had been the reigning king longer, it wasn't just about acting styles. It was about identity, about who Hollywood should idolize, and what kind of man the public should admire. There were also darker, more whispered theories. Grant's sexuality, long the subject of speculation, was often brought up in hushed tones when people tried to explain the divide. Gable, who built his career on exaggerated masculinity, was rumored to be uncomfortable around actors who didn't play by the same rules. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. The perception alone was enough to drive a wedge. Then there were the passive-aggressive moments, small but telling. At an industry banquet, Gable once praised actors who didn't hide behind style, a thinly veiled jab many interpreted as a shot at Grant. Meanwhile, Grant would give interviews praising actors who didn't confuse shouting with skill. Subtle but pointed, like chess players taking quiet, careful jabs, always from a distance. For fans, the rivalry remained invisible. They loved both men for different reasons. Gable was the wildfire, Grant, the control flame. But within Hollywood's inner circles, the coldness between them was legendary. People would recount stories of events where the two icons were seated across the room and never spoke. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just two giants pretending the other didn't exist. And when Gable died suddenly in 1960, Cary Grant offered a simple, respectful statement to the press. Polite, distant, measured, just like always. There were no warm tributes, no stories shared, no revelations of a long-lost friendship, just silence. And in that silence, many believed, was all the confirmation anyone needed. Because sometimes, the most telling part of the story is what's not said. Decades after Cary Grant and Clark Gable ruled Hollywood's golden age, their stories still captivate us, not just for their iconic films, but for the complex legacies they left behind. Their rivalry, subtle but persistent, offers a rare glimpse into a Hollywood obsessed not only with fame, but with identity. What it meant to be a man, a star, and a legend. Cary Grant's career became a symbol of elegance, wit, and control. He was a man who could charm a room without raising his voice, who could be funny and serious without breaking a sweat. His image was carefully curated, almost like a work of art. And beneath that charm was a deep desire for respect. Respect not just for himself, but for the craft of acting. For Grant, every performance was a statement about who he was and who Hollywood should celebrate. Clark Gable's legacy is different, but just as powerful. He embodied raw masculinity, strength, and a kind of fearless vulnerability. The king of Hollywood was a man who lived on his own terms, flaws and all. His performances captured the spirit of an era that celebrated rugged individualism, passion, and unapologetic confidence. Gable didn't need refinement. He owned the room because he was authentic to his style, no matter how rough around the edges. Their tension reflected more than personal dislike. It mirrored a larger cultural shift. Hollywood was at a crossroads between the polished sophistication of the 1930s and the raw, emotional intensity of post-war America. And Grant and Gable stood on opposite ends of that divide. In many ways, Grant's quiet resentment toward Gable wasn't just about personality clash. It was about a battle for the soul of Hollywood masculinity. Grant wanted to keep things classy and refined. Gable was all about primal energy and charisma. Neither was right or wrong. They were just different ideals competing for the spotlight. Today, when we look back, it's tempting to pick sides. Are you Team Grant's smooth sophistication or Team Gable's rugged charm? But the truth is, their rivalry shows us how complicated stardom really is. It's not just about talent or popularity. It's about how stars reflect the hopes, fears, and desires of the culture around them. And maybe that's why their story still resonates. Because behind the glitz and glamour, behind the smiles and cameras, two men who seemed unstoppable were also deeply human, flawed, competitive, and longing to be understood on their own terms. So the next time you watch a Cary Grant movie or a Clark Gable classic, remember, you're not just seeing performances. You're witnessing two very different visions of what it means to be a star. And the tension between those visions, that's the real story. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden rivalries, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories you won't hear anywhere else.